Death and the Ugly Woman by Bruce D. Arthurs. In those years when the snow falls lightly upon the distant mountains, the river Gorkin flows slowly. The water low in its bed, water in trapped pools stagnates. Warmed by the lengthening day of summer, the slow water of the shallows become dark with growth and ringed with scum. On the cool moorings, a faint and odorous miasma can be seen rising from the surface. Drifting, the faint mist wafts its way, reaching into the Isure, Rist, and other villages and towns along the Gorkin. It is in such a year that young children are watched with extra care for the beginnings of fever, disease, dizziness, nausea. Such were the first symptoms of bone crush fever. It is said that Death rode the Gorkin in a black skiff, tall and pale, dark of hair. He traveled in the fineries of a lord. Black opals adorned the rings on his fingers, and black diamonds studded the hilt of the long, slender bladed knife at his side. It was said that he entered the homes where children lay sick with bone crush. No locks nor bars could ever prevent his entrance, and Death would stand over the feverish children and smile, and draw the knife from its sheath and thrust the thin blade woundlessly into their bones and joints, and the children would die screaming. The two sons and daughter of Dur, a fisherman of the Isir, lay sick with fever. The daughter, Resti, lay awake, teeth chattering with fever and fear. She was old enough to have heard tales of Death and his knife. She tried to focus on the darkness before her. She could hear the troubled sleep of her brothers across the room, and faintly the snores of her father in the room next door, as he slept finally after caring for them all day. The night clouds drifted away from the moon, allowing the pale rays to illuminate the plain but clean room. Death stood before her, Death with his jeweled knife held in a jeweled hand. He tilted her head back with one cold hand, shifted to one side so the moon would light her face. He made a disgusted noise deep in his throat. Resti knew what he saw. Pig face, the other children called her. With her pushed-up nose, her bulging eyes, slack lips, failing to hide the twisted teeth behind.
Hey, baby.
Sorry? Donnie, where were we? Death stood before her, Death with his jeweled knife held in his jeweled hand. He tilted her head back with one cold hand, shifted to one side so the moon would light her face. He made a disgusted noise deep in his throat. Resti knew what he saw. Pig face, the other children called her. Her with a pushed-up nose, her bulging eyes, slack lip, failing to hide the twisted teeth behind, in the thin, lank hair. Beneath the covers, her body was squat, thick, the curve of her spine twisting one shoulder higher than the other. "One like you, I do not want," Death whispered. Turned away. Missed that cue. Resti closed her eyes again, the pain in her heart. To be rejected even by Death, a tear rolled down to her sweat-filmed cheek. Ross, her eldest brother, began to scream as Death's knife thrust into him again and again. Resti threw back her covers, staggering up, lurched forward. She laid hold of Death with fever-weakened hands. Resti toppled back against her own bed, falling to the floor beside it. The last thing she saw that night was her father rushing in, his arms reaching out in hopeless comforting towards Ross, reaching through death and invisible to him. Later, Friend too began to scream, but Resty was not conscious to hear it. Dur had taken the boat out of the harbor and into the open sea, far from the other fishing boats. The weighted sacks containing his sons lay on the deck. The ship slowed, and the sun sparkled water. The ship slowed in the sun-sparkled water as he lowered the sail. Resty was still weak, but the fever was gone. Her mind was clear, but heavy. Resty, her father called her over to him, and she helped him lift the sacks one by one over the rail. The dark shapes vanished quickly as they sank beneath the surface. Dur stared down into the depths for long after the sacks were gone. Finally, sighing, he turned to Resty. "When I die," he began, "and go to join your mother and your brothers, this boat will be yours." He regarded his twisted figure of a daughter for several long seconds. "You will have no one to share it with, no husband to man it for you. It is time you learned the ways of the sea." Dur died when Resty was 16, swept overboard when a squall caught them before they could reach the safety of the port. By then she had learned the handling of the boat, the ways of catching fish, the skill of market bargaining. Years of hauling nets and manning the tiller and sail had put firm muscle on her squat frame. In the festival days of the year when she turned 16, she was walking toward her room after selling her catch. The streets were heavy with celebrants dressed in their brightest and best, and children ran wild. "Sea cow! A sea cow has come out of the water!" A child was shouting and pointing at her. Other children joined around him and laughed. "Sea cow! Sea cow!" They all began to shout. Resty turned and walked quickly into an alleyway. She had never grown used to the taunts and calls, even after all the years of it. The shouts faded behind her as she traveled down the narrow, glooming backways. She passed where the alley widened temporarily into a small form a small courtyard. A group of men, strangers to her, sat on a doorstep, passing a bottle back and forth between them. Their loud talk stopped as Resty entered the courtyard, and they stared as she walked past. They stared as she walked past. She heard muttering and then a burst of coarse laughter from behind them as she re-entered the alley on the other side. A moment later, she heard the running steps behind her. A glance back showed the men were coming toward her. She ran, twisting and dodging through the maze of alleyways, but the men stayed with her. She was becoming short of breath and stopped, reaching for the fishing knife on her belt as she turned. The bottle was smashed into her arm, bouncing and shattering in the cobblestones. The knife slipped from her stunned fingers, and then the men were on her. Two grabbed her arms, a third tossed his jacket over her head and held it there, muffling her screams and bites. Two more grabbed her legs and forced them apart. The sixth fumbled and tugged at her trousers, then cut them loose with a knife. They were all laughing. There was a ripping pain between her legs, a heavy grunting weight on top of her, long seconds of painful thrusting, and a spurt of hot liquid inside her. "I said I could fuck the ugliest woman in the whole Gorican," the man said, laughing as he withdrew. "Who's next?" Resty named the baby Pearl. The child was perfect in every form, except for the brown bar and the blue iris of her left eye. Others stared disapprovingly as Resty took Pearl with her on the boat each day. She disregarded the stares. The taunts of the children became ignorable. Pearl's first steps were taken on the swaying deck of the boat. The first word she spoke was fish. When Pearl was 3, the Gorican lowered and grew slow, and a faint mist would rise from its surface on cool mornings. Rusty sat silently in the unlighted room, listening to the restless tossing and turning of Pearl. The bright moon shone through the window, gleaming from the fear in Rusty's eyes, flashing from the blade of the knife she held. Death entered through the locked and barred door. Rusty rose to stand between the dark figure and Pearl. Death barely glanced at Rusty as he moved forward. Her knife rose up and slashed across his cheek. The blade moved silently, effortlessly through the dark fabric, the dark unknown beneath it, harmlessly. There was no sign of tear or cut. Rusty stepped back, thrust toward where Death's heart, if heart he had, would be. The blade slid in again, then stopped as Rusty's fist thudded against the chest of Death. Death grunted, surprise on the pale face. He grabbed Rusty's arm and squeezed the wrist with the chill strength. The knife dropped from her fingers, falling through Death onto the floor. She struggled again in his frigid grasp. Death tossed her to one side, the chair smashing as she fell over and into it. She scrambled on the floor, grabbed one of the dark-clad legs, and bit into it ferociously. Death roared with pain as the taste of bloody ice flooded Rusty's mouth. He seized her by her shoulders and threw her violently against the wall. Rusty fell, stunned and almost senseless, into a heap on the floor. She barely saw as the dark figure limped to Pearl's bed. The tailor had just finished sewing the shroud tight around the small body when someone in the crowd outside sighted Rusty returning. Her lank hair was plastered tightly to her broad skull. The water dripped from her sodden clothing as she walked, slowly, blindly, down the street. Her eyes, too, were wet, but not from the river or ocean water. The crowd parted silently as Rusty passed within. The tailor stood as Rusty entered. "He would not take me," Rusty said dully. I held the stone tight and jumped into the deepest part of the Gorican, and still he would not take me. I woke in the shallows, my face out of the water, still alive, breath still in me. The tailor gathered up his needles and thread, the bolt of dark material. "I have other children waiting for me," he said, and left. The season of the sickness passed. The next year, the Gorican flowed at its normal level, and the year after that, and the year after that. Rusty lost herself, it seemed, in work. The usual labor of a one-man fishing boat could easily fill the day's hours, but she did more. She began using a larger net, straining to haul the catch aboard. When that became too easy, then she switched to a larger one still. The other fishermen tapped their heads and called her mad when she fitted a long sculling oar to the stern of her boat. When they returned home from the day, sails full, they would frequently pass Rusty as she pushed the oar back and forth, sweat dripping from her as the oar pushed the heavy, cumbersome boat through the water. After selling the catch, she would plod to her rooms to fall into an exhausted sleep. Her arms and most of her body grew rigid and knotted with muscle. To others, she became even more grotesque, uglier than ever. Festival. Again, the streets of Issyr were filled with traders, travelers, and performers and rabble. Rusty walked towards her room, lost in her private thoughts. Many who saw her shied away and made room for her to pass. One man, talking with another as he walked, struck her with his shoulder. "Damn you," he began, then stopped. as he looked down at her. He gave a bark of rough laughter and walked away. Rusty stood motionless. 7 years ago, 7 years might have added that touch of gray to his beard, those lines around his eyes. Might was not a certainty, however, but one of his blue eyes had a bar of brown. She followed the two men into a tavern 7th Street's way. It was smoky and poorly lit inside. Some of the men knew her from the docks and became silent when they saw the look in her eyes. The man she had followed was at the bar, raising a mug of beer to his lips. She moved behind him and spoke. "I recognized you, too." He turned slowly. He was big, nearly a head taller than Rusty, and strongly muscled. His face was twisted into a sneer. "What do you want, hunchback?" "Tell me the name of your daughter," Rusty answered. Then he stared at her blankly for 7 seconds, then laughed and slammed the mug into the side of her face. She grabbed the front of his shirt as she stumbled back, blood pouring into one eye. Recovering, she yanked him off his feet and threw him onto a table. He came up at her with a knife in his hands. The blade burned down her ribs. She clamped his knife arm under her own, used her other arm to yank his elbow across her chest. He screamed as the tendons ripped. Rusty pushed him back, then wrapped her arms around his chest and squeezed. The muscles in her arms and shoulders strained with effort. A hoarse, low scream hissed from the man's mouth as the air was pressed from his lungs. His ribs made a sound like cracking knuckles as they broke. There was a louder crack as his spine snapped. His eyes rolled up into his head, and he went limp in Rusty's arms. She dropped the body on the floor and stood over it, panting. Blood soaked her side and dripped from her face onto the dead man. "I'm ready now," she whispered. "Now." The Gorkin was low the next year. Rusty walked the empty streets of the Isior at night, alert for the sounds of the sick and restless, the lights of the lone candles as parents watched over their children. She met Death close to the docks. "I can touch you," she told him as she barred his way. "I can hurt you." "You have no cause to impede me," the dark figure replied. "Memory is my cause. I am strong." "I too am strong," she said, and attacked. Death lay in the street, writhing, gasping in pain as he tried to move his useless legs. "You have broken the back of Death," he groaned. "Little enough payment for my heart," Rusty panted. Death's hands twisted together, despairing. "Have mercy, then, and finish me." With both hands, he held out his jeweled knife, hilt first to her. Slowly, Rusty reached to take it. Like a serpent, Death struck. The knife dropped as he seized her hand, but before she could react, Death had twisted an object hidden in his hand onto her finger. She jumped back as Death released her and stared at the black opal ring on her hand. She tugged and twisted, but the ring was firm. Death lay back upon the ground. He gave a quiet laugh and died. Rusty watched as the clothing and flesh of Death dissipated into a pale smoke. A skeleton of ice lay in the street, melting quickly in the warm night air. She turned and walked away down the empty street toward her rooms. She stopped when she saw the light as she passed. She stopped when she saw the light as she passed a row of houses. She moved silently to the window, listening to the labored breathing behind it. The door opened at her touch, and she entered, moving past where the child mother sat by the candle. She stared down at the young child for long moments. Finally, she leaned down and pressed the small lips with her own. It is said that in the season of bone crush fever, Death rides the Gorkin in a black boat fitted with a long sculling oar. Death is twisted in shape, grotesque and scarred in face. She wears a black opal ring upon one hand and carries a sharp fishing knife at her side. But the knife is never unsheathed, and the children die gently in their sleep. Hope you remembered that one, honey.